It sounds like success from the outside, a garage empire, a TV breakthrough, a name that defined an entire era of custom motorcycle culture. But inside that world, behind the cameras and noise and metal sparks, something else was always happening. Pressure, distance, and the slow weight of building something too big to control. Jesse James didn't just build motorcycles. He built a brand that became larger than the man himself. West Coast Choppers wasn't just a workshop anymore. It became a symbol, a lifestyle, a machine of identity. But machines, no matter how powerful, still break under their own weight. At one point, he had over 200 employees, a fully vertical operation, production lines, contracts, deadlines, responsibility stacked on top of responsibility. And then came the truth he later admitted without hesitation. I was miserable. Because bigger doesn't always mean better, and more money doesn't always mean more freedom. Sometimes it means less of everything that made you start in the first place. The early version of Jesse wasn't built in a studio. He wasn't manufactured by television. He was shaped in a far more unstable environment. A childhood split by separation. A father who was present, but not always available. A young mind exposed early to independence. Too early. And independence, when it arrives before guidance, often turns into rebellion. By his own admissions, he didn't follow a straight path. He stole cars. He pushed boundaries. He learned mechanical skill not in classrooms, but in experience. And that contradiction would follow him for the rest of his life, because the same mind that could create precision machines was also the mind that struggled with structure. At 19, he wasn't thinking about fame. He was working security jobs, bodyguard work, bouncer work, anything that paid enough to survive. But underneath it all, something else was forming. A direction, a skill, a pull toward fabrication that he couldn't ignore. And when he finally opened his first shop using his mother's garage, it didn't look like a business. It looked like risk. But that risk became the foundation of everything. Then came the moment that changed everything. A documentary, Motorcycle Mania, raw, unfiltered, real, no production polish, no corporate framing, just Jesse, metal, and chaos being shaped into machines. That project didn't just introduce him to audiences. It introduced him to an industry that didn't even know it needed him yet. Discovery saw something different. Not just a mechanic, not just a builder, but a personality that could carry reality television. And that's how Monster Garage was born. A concept built on controlled chaos. Take a normal machine, destroy its limits, rebuild it into something it was never meant to be. And Jesse became the center of it. Not just hosting it, but embodying it. For many viewers, this was a golden era. A time when fabrication was entertainment. When sparks flying in a garage could hold primetime attention. When engineering felt like storytelling. But behind the success, there was a cost no camera captured. Because every project completed meant another deadline. Every episode meant more pressure. Every season meant higher expectations. And eventually, the system that made him famous began to feel like a cage. That's when the shift happened. The move toward Austin. The creation of Austin Speed Shop. A new chapter. A new attempt at recapturing something lost. But lightning, as they say, rarely strikes the same place twice. The idea was simple. Recreate the energy of Monster Garage. Bring back the magic. But television doesn't repeat emotion easily. And when the show launched, reality didn't match expectation. 3 episodes, then silence. Not failure in the dramatic sense, but absence. The absence of impact. The absence of momentum. And for someone like Jesse, who had built entire worlds on momentum, that absence was loud. But life outside television was louder. Because while cameras faded, real life didn't. Relationships, legal battles, public scrutiny, personal instability, all of it running parallel to his career. And unlike machines, these problems couldn't be rebuilt with tools. His personal life became a cycle of connection and collapse. Marriage, divorce, reconstruction, repeat. Each relationship carrying the same pattern of intensity and fracture. And the public watched it all unfold as if it were part of the brand. But there was no branding in emotional damage. No polish in personal collapse. Just consequences. At different points, He tried to stabilize, to step away from chaos, to simplify. But simplicity is difficult for people who have lived inside extremes. Even his business empire began to shrink from vertical dominance into focused craftsmanship again, not because he failed, but because he chose to step out of the version of success that no longer felt like his. And that decision is often the one audiences misunderstand the most. Because from the outside, stepping back looks like falling off, but from the inside, it often looks like survival. Today, the conversation around Jesse is different. Less about dominance, more about reflection, less about expansion, more about perspective. The machine builder has become something else entirely, a reminder that success is not linear, and that identity is not permanent, because even the most powerful builds eventually require takedown, not to be destroyed, but to be understood again. And that might be the real story of Jesse James. Not the fame, not the shows, not the controversy, but the cycle. Build, break, rebuild. And somewhere in that cycle, the real person always tries to reappear, picking up from the point where the story stops being about television and starts becoming about something far more personal. Because when the cameras disappear, the machines don't stop. They just stop performing. And that's where reality begins. For Jesse James, the post-television years weren't a collapse. They were a recalibration. But recalibration is never comfortable when your entire identity was once built on visibility. There's a moment every creator eventually faces, especially those who come from something loud, fast, and public. The moment where silence feels heavier than noise, where absence feels like loss, even when it's chosen. After the peak years of Monster Garage and the cultural impact of the West Coast Choppers era, Jesse didn't just step away from fame. He stepped away from the version of himself that fame required. And that version, loud, constant, always producing, always building, doesn't vanish quietly. It lingers in habits, in expectations, in the way people still remember you. Inside the walls of Austin Speed Shop, the atmosphere was different from television sets. No countdowns, no producers shouting timing, no forced drama for cameras, just fabrication, steel, design, problem-solving in real time. But even in that quieter environment, the pressure didn't disappear. It just changed shape, because now there was no show to carry the identity, no production team to frame the narrative. Everything had to stand on craftsmanship alone. And craftsmanship is brutally honest. It either works, or it doesn't. There is no editing. There is no second take. That honesty is what drew Jesse back to it. But it is also what stripped away the illusion that success had ever been simple. Over time, the industry around him evolved. Custom fabrication became more digital, more corporate, more systemized. Younger builders entered the scene with different tools, different audiences, and different expectations. And suddenly, the world Jesse helped shape was no longer centered around him. That shift is something most public figures never talk about directly, because it doesn't feel like failure. But it doesn't feel like victory either. It feels like time moving without asking permission. Meanwhile, his personal life, already heavily documented in public, continued its own unpredictable rhythm. Relationships formed quickly. Collapses followed faster than expected. Public narratives replaced private reality. And somewhere between headlines and reality shows, the actual human experience often got lost. But behind all of it, there was still the same core identity. A builder, a problem solver, a person who understands machines more comfortably than media. And that's where the misunderstanding often begins with figures like him. People assume the story is about fame, or controversy, or success and failure. But internally, it's often about something much simpler. Control, or the loss of it, or the attempt to regain it in environments where control is never permanent. There's a reason so many builders eventually step away from scale. Because scale changes the relationship between creator and creation. At small scale, you build with your hands. At large scale, you manage other people building with their hands. And those are not the same experience. Not emotionally, not creatively, not personally. That distinction became clearer in Jesse's later years as he intentionally reduced the size of his operations. Less empire, more workshop, less production, more precision. Not because he couldn't scale, but because scaling no longer felt like the point. And in that shift, something subtle happened. The narrative around him stopped being about dominance in the industry and started becoming about endurance inside it. Because longevity in fabrication, especially in public-facing industries, is rarely about staying the biggest. It's about staying consistent when the spotlight moves elsewhere. What remains interesting about Jesse's story is not just what he built, but what he refused to become permanently attached to. Television didn't define him forever. Business expansion didn't trap him indefinitely. Public perception, even at its loudest, didn't fully contain him. Instead, he moved in cycles. Expand, retreat, rebuild, refocus. And that cycle is far more common among creators than audiences realize, especially those who start in hands-on industries and are later pulled into entertainment ecosystems. Because eventually, every craftsman has to decide whether they are building for the work or building for the audience watching the work. And those two paths rarely align long-term. Today, when people revisit the legacy of Monster Garage or the West Coast Shoppers era, they often do so through nostalgia. A remembered time when mechanical creativity was mainstream entertainment, when fabrication felt raw, physical, immediate. But nostalgia often smooths out the tension that existed behind the scenes. The deadlines, the burnout, the constant demand for more, and the quiet realization that anything built for mass attention eventually becomes unsustainable in its original form. That realization is not failure. It is clarity, and clarity is what ultimately reshapes the direction of people like Jesse. Not scandal, not decline, but understanding limits, and choosing to work within them differently. In many ways, that is the most honest version of his story. Not the myth, not the television persona, but the builder who learned when to stop expanding outward and start refining inward. Because at a certain point, every machine, no matter how powerful, requires maintenance. And every builder, no matter how successful, requires distance from noise to see clearly again. The garage remains, the tools remain, the skill remains, but the intention evolves. And maybe that's the part most people miss when they ask, what happened to Jesse James? Nothing happened to him. He simply stopped being only one version of himself and started becoming something quieter, something more controlled, something closer to the original reason he began building in the first place. Not for fame, not for television, but for the process itself. And in the end, that is where every real builder eventually returns. Not to the spotlight, but to the work. Always the work. You can't scale that without changing it. And that's where tension lives. Outside the shop, the public narrative kept moving. Television appearances, business expansions, interviews, headlines that focus on rise, fall, reinvention, controversy, recovery. But inside the actual work environment, none of those words mattered. Steel doesn't care about narrative. Aluminum doesn't care about reputation. Machines don't respond to public perception. They respond to precision. And precision is where Jesse has always lived best. That's why, despite everything, despite the chaos of media cycles, personal relationships, public scrutiny, and shifting business landscapes, he always returns to fabrication. Because fabrication is honest. If something is wrong, it doesn't pretend to be right. It fails immediately, or it works. There is no interpretation layer in between. But life outside the workshop is not that clean. It bends. It distorts. It repeats mistakes in different forms. Relationships reflect that pattern more than anything else in his story. People like to frame those parts of his life as scandal, but that's too shallow to explain what actually happens when someone lives at high intensity for long enough. What really happens is collision. Collision between identity and expectation, between personal instinct and public narrative, between freedom and structure. And collision always leaves marks, not always visible ones. Sometimes they show up as decisions that don't make sense from the outside. Sometimes they show up as sudden shifts in direction. Sometimes they show up as stepping away from something that looks successful to everyone else but feels unsustainable to the person living inside it. That's the part people miss. From the outside, it looks like instability. From the inside, it feels like survival. Because not every exit is a failure. Some exits are corrections. Back in Austin, the shop continues to move the way it always has. Half controlled, half instinctive. Projects evolve in stages that don't always follow timelines. Ideas appear, disappear, return later in different forms. Nothing is entirely linear, and that's intentional, because linear systems don't work well for creative builders. They work for factories, not for minds that think in solutions before steps. There is something almost therapeutic in watching raw material become structure again. A flat sheet becomes form. A damaged frame becomes alignment. A broken system becomes functional. It mirrors something deeper than mechanics. It mirrors rebuilding itself. Not just machines, but identity. Every project in that shop carries a version of that idea, even when no one says it out loud. And that's why the story of Jesse James keeps resurfacing again and again in automotive culture. Not because of controversy, not because of television, but because of process. Because process is the only part that stays consistent when everything else changes. Years pass, businesses rise and fall, partnerships shift, public perception evolves. But fabrication remains the same language: heat, pressure, material, correction. And in that language, Jesse has never stopped being fluent. There's a moment in every builder's life where they have to decide whether they are building for scale or building for meaning. Most people never notice a decision when it happens. They only notice the outcome later. Bigger doesn't always mean better. Faster doesn't always mean progress. More visible doesn't always mean more fulfilled. And somewhere inside this entire journey, West Coast choppers, television fame, Austin speed shop, personal chaos, reinvention, there's a consistent thread that doesn't change. A refusal to stop building, even when the world changes around it. Even when the spotlight fades or intensifies. Even when narrative tries to define the story before it finishes writing itself. Because for someone like Jesse James, stopping is never really an option. Only rebuilding is. And rebuilding, by nature, always begins where everything else is already broken down. Not as an ending, but as a reset point that most people never see coming. And maybe that's a part of the story that matters most. Not the rise, not the fall, not the headlines in between, but the return to the shop floor, where nothing is explained, only made. And in that return, there's no announcement, no applause, no explanation for the outside world to decode. Just the familiar sound of work resuming where it was always meant to be. Steel meets steel again. Sparks fall like brief constellations and disappear before they can be remembered. A hand steadies a frame. A measurement is checked twice, not because of doubt, but because experience teaches respect for small details. This is where everything that ever mattered to Jesse James still exists, not in headlines, not in television edits, not in public opinion cycles, but in the quiet discipline of building something real from something raw. Because in the end, machines don't lie. They reflect effort. They reflect patience. They reflect intention. And every project that leaves a shop like this carries a truth that no story can fully capture. It was made by someone who refused to stop creating, even when the world tried to define what creation should look like. The noise of fame fades the same way it arrived. Slowly, then all at once. What remains is the work. The unfinished ideas. The next frame waiting to be cut. The next problem waiting to be solved. Out there, people will continue to debate success, failure, legacy, controversy. But inside the workshop, none of those words survive long enough to matter. Only progress does. And as the lights dim across the space, leaving only the glow of a single workbench still active, the message becomes clear without ever needing to be spoken. Everything ends somewhere. But builders don't think in endings. They think in the next piece, the next weld, the next chance to get it right. And that is where the story continues, quietly, endlessly, without permission from anyone watching outside.